President Ramaphosa and President Donald Trump, the encounter of the fourth kind. Let me open with a quote from one of the greatest military strategists, Sun Tzu. I open his mouth. Which of the two sovereigns is imbued with the moral law? Which of the two generals has most ability? With whom lies the advantages derived from heaven and earth? If he is secure at all points, be prepared for him. If he is in superior strength, evade him. If your opponent is of choleric temper, seek to irritate him. Pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant. I close Sun Tzu's mouth from Art of War. On the 21st of May 2025, the President of the Republic of South Africa, His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, and his delegation visited Washington to have discussions with the President of the United States, His Excellency Donald Trump. Now let me say that the two countries have got no names. The Republic of South Africa, the United States of America. Just adjectival phrases. Anyway, let's continue. Now the drama of the anticipated meeting to the notorious Oval Room of the White House evoked heated debates before and post facto. Africa and the world waited with bated breath to see the encounter unfold. Now, before President Ramaphosa, there were other high-profile figures who were exposed to the theatre of the Oval Room, which has now become a TV talk show room. These are President Zelensky of the Ukraine and Prime Minister Starmer of Britain and the Prime Minister of Canada, Carney. Now, what we would have expected that the South African delegation learned a lot from the preceding meetings in order to deploy their strategy or how to avoid being ambushed and humiliated. The debates after that meeting have reached their climax, and they will soon touch the denouement and end point. Now, views which have been expressed manifest irreconcilable perspectives regarding the content and context of these meetings. Now, some regard President Ramaphosa's meeting as a resounding success, while others think otherwise. On both extremes, there are firm opinions that the visit was unnecessary and did not bear fruit, while on the other, the adventure of the meeting is upheld and granted approbation. Now, in between, there are 50 shades of grey. The event has transpired now, and it's now water under the bridge. Arguing about it can only amount to retrospective wishful thinking, which unfortunately has got no consequence on the reality that has passed. Now, what is my business in this business? What I intend to do, with the advantage of hindsight, is to reflect on what better preparation could have entailed. I would like to do this with regard to what seemed to have been blind spots in the strategy of the South African team. Now, to this effect, I would like to take a panoramic view of the encounter between the two presidents, their strategic and tactical maneuvers in their encounter of the 21st May 2025. When the meeting was announced, it was anticipated with bated breath, and it was watched with angst as it unfolded by people around the world. Now, bearing in mind that South Africa stamped its diplomatic presence on the international stage when it brought Israel to the International Court of Justice on 29 December 2023, it must be borne in mind that there was a grudge against South Africa by the United States and some of its allies in the West. Now, the South African team prepared very well in the ICJ case against Israel, and they gathered a formidable team which presented a cogent and convincing argument. What did South Africa say at the ICJ? South Africa alleged that Israel had committed and was committing genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, contravening the Genocide Convention, including what South Africa described as Israel's 75-year apartheid, 56-year occupation, and 16-year blockade of the Gaza Strip. South Africa requested that the ICJ indicate provisional measures of protection, including the immediate suspension of Israel's operations. I end there on the South African case. Now you can imagine how that infuriated the United States government, and of course some allies in Western Europe. Let us also reminisce, just in passing, that successive Republican administrations in the US and the Tory administration in the UK supported apartheid during its height. Particularly, but not exclusively, Ronald Reagan and Premier Margaret Thatcher. Their terms overlapped. Margaret Thatcher was Premier from 1979 to 1990, and Ronald Reagan was President from 1981 to 1989. Now, Thatcher opposed sanctions of any kind against apartheid South Africa. Reagan publicly opposed the anti-apartheid bill. In August 1986, the Senate passed a version of the Anti-Apartheid Act with weaker sanctions by a veto margin of 84 to 14. Now, talking about Republicans and Democrats, that does not necessarily mean that Democrats fared any better. If one considers what one of the greatest scholars, Noam Chomsky, said, that the US is a one-party state with two factions. Now, history has a huge reservoir of memory, but let me not dwell on history. Suffice it to say that South Africa was walking into a lion's den, more so with the recent Israeli case that I've cited. I regard it as an encounter of the fourth kind, and that is not a far-fetched metaphor. Now, for the purpose of this monologue, I will deploy two theoretical concepts and a model of analysis for strategic planning to guide my train of thought. The two concepts are the Aristotelian theory of the hubris and hamartia of a tragic hero. Aristotle defines hubris as the tragic weakness of a larger-than-life character, and the hubris as an act of missing the mark in a matter of gravity, making a wrong decision which might have fatal consequences. The second framework is the SWOT analysis. It's got 5 steps. Step 1, you gather the data on information that you need internally or externally. Step 2, you assess your internal strengths and also the strengths of your opponent. Number 3, you assess your internal weaknesses and also those of your opponent. Step 4, you assess your external opportunities. Step 5, you assess your external threats. Now, following these two theoretical frameworks, I will present 10 points where the strategy of the South African team fell short of what one would have expected. I will also point out how these shortcomings should have been mitigated. I'll then conclude with reference again to Sun Tzu's maxims of the art of warfare. What my premise is, that is what I proposed, is that the South African team, despite apparent thorough preparation for the encounter behind the scenes, was not successful at a micro or strategic level, or were poor at micro or tactical level. Now, this hypothesis is based on 10 weaknesses. One main point to remember is that both President Ramaphosa and President Trump have nothing to lose because their terms are facing a terminal point with no chance of coming back. That is, if we believe in democracy. But before I delve in the purpose of the South African team's visit, let us hear the objectives of the visit as pronounced by His Excellency, President Ramaphosa. I take it from the horse's mouth. Our objective in coming here was to reset relations between the two countries and to position our relations which have become contaminated by some of the issues that have been raised during the engagement, or what people may have thought that they were contaminated relations. That is the ICJ case and Ukraine, Russia, and all that. And it turned out that yes, it is about safety of people in South Africa, much as he zeroed it down to white farmers. First, the South African team did not do a meticulous profiling of Trump in encounters. If they did, then it was not manifest in how they handled the ambush of video clips played by Trump, which exhibited the rebel-rousing and obsolete and misguided slogans and chants of Julius Malema. Malema was a convenient sword to step South Africa on the flank with. You see, President Donald Trump and the self-styled Commander-in-Chief Julius Malema have similar personal traits and also antithetical political fortunes. They are characterized by a narcissistic streak, egomania, bigotry, and they thrive on political melodrama. Trump plays on the stage of a Christian fundamentalist, while Malema on the mythical image of a revolutionary, benighted. They both portray themselves playing the role of protagonist in the script of the drama and theatre of delusions of their self-perceptions. While in Trump's case, one can understand that, even if begrudgingly, that his grandeur is based on the powerful position that he holds as the head of one of the biggest economies in the world, which straddles the world like a colossus of military might. On the other hand, poor Malema holds an impregnable arsenal of vitriol, slogans and misguided Pan-Africanism, a caricature of Hans Christian Andersen's Naked Emperor and Shoika's General Basha Bash in King Babu. Now, they are opposites in that one has managed to achieve term 2 as President of the United States, and the other's aspirations ejected from the flight of the presidency of a political youth league. Now let us look at issues closely. Now this meeting, as I said, was highly anticipated. Now let us acknowledge that it might have been necessary or it might not have been necessary. But I think, if I may go back to Malema, pardon me, not that I like him, I think he was a good tool as an illustration of Trump's optical illusion and anecdotal evidence of the presumed persecution of white farmers, a few of them, and expropriation of land by force and their mass murder. Now these really misguided slogans put up a stronger case for Trump than he could have ever mastered. Now the second point is that the South African team allowed themselves to be dictated to by Trump even before they arrived here. He told them who to include in their team. And above all, they even allowed him to give these people a turn to speak with President Ramaphosa's tacit acquiescence to that. Third, the South African team did not prepare historical comparisons between South Africa and the US about race. There are many problems, there are many similar problems in South Africa and the US. But the advantage in South Africa is that there are mitigating institutions which have managed some of these problems relatively better, without suggesting, for example, the building of a high wall between us and our neighbors. But by saying that, I do not mean that we are on top of our game. I'm comparing the best and the better. No, I'm comparing the bad and the worst. Fourth, the South African team did not prepare statistics to demonstrate that crime is not racialized, but it's a class problem. Of course, these are easily available from SA stats. The majority of black people and other white people who are not farmers are subject to crime. I still have to be convinced that the US is faring better on crime, especially on mass import and export of drugs by cartels. They are not faring very well by any standards. Well, fifth, I think that they do not prepare how to keep the conversation in line with the agenda. Thus, they allowed President Trump to be in control of the encounter. This was most important because they could have told him, Mr. President, we are getting lost because we seem to be straying from our agenda of points of common cause. That would not have been rude. If your opponent is of choleric temper, seek to irritate him, so says Sun Tzu, as I quoted earlier. Sixth, they did not prepare for comparison between South Africa and the US on illegal immigration, border control and crime, so that they could show that both countries have the same problem to contend with. Mr. President, are you suggesting that we should use your model of repatriating illegal immigrants, as you do here? Seventh, they should have mentioned South African mitigating apparatus of rule of law and pointed specifically to the Bill of Rights. Section 25 of the Bill of Rights is about property. It says no one may be deprived of property except in terms of law of general application, and no law may permit arbitrary deprivation of property. Property may be expropriated only in terms of law of general application. Now, this is subject to compensation, the amount of which and the time and manner of payment of which have either been agreed to by those affected or decided or approved by law. Now, the amount of compensation and the time and manner must be just and equitable, reflecting an equitable balance between the public interest and the interest of those affected, having regard to all circumstances, including 1, the current use of the property, the history of the acquisition and use of the property. Now, coming to reference to Malema's misguided slogans and chants, that could have been easily dismissed without individuating him and his party by reference to these mitigating institutions, Chapter 9 institutions that are entrenched in the Constitution, especially the Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission is the body which deals with hate speech, such as Malema's. Well, one does not have to belabor the point that there are many black people who are killed, who are victims of violent crime, far more than those who are crying foul that this crime is directed against them. Please, I'm not saying that the killing is justifiable. It's not. One death is one too many. But within the context of what Trump was saying, this should have been handy. Now, a point that would have been in place as a point of irritation was the 6th of January 2021, the violent attack on the US Capitol. That was an attempted coup d'etat. That was an assault on the US Constitution in the worst manner possible. Malema's posturing would have been set aside without even referring to his party. They did not have to go into minutiae of the fact that the mob involved on January 6th were charged, convicted, and jailed. But Trump freed them en masse as soon as he ascended to the presidency. Now, a passing mention of this would have put his anecdotal allegations to rest. This would have been a clear comparison which demonstrated that the United States democracy is more fragile than South Africa's. That would have been a trump card, the ace of spades for Ramaphosa. It would have implicitly underlined the difference between Malema's impunity with the capital violence. Mr. President, I don't have the luxury of powers to write executive orders to arrest or release people from jail. End of the story. Number 8. South Africa has strong checks and balances which curtail potential authoritarianism, especially of the president. In South Africa, the regulations that the president promulgates are guided by democratic processes that go through rigorous prescripts of the Constitution. In this regard, perhaps it was good that the team referred to Mandela's lesson, but that was personalizing and individuating the broad issue. Forgiveness here translated into the TRC, which was a mechanism which accommodated white perpetrators of apartheid, who were not prosecuted like the Israelis pursued the Nazis after the Third Reich. South Africa even went to the extent of giving parole to Ku Klux Klan-minded people, murderers like Janus Valus, or Valus Janus, whatever it is. He was given parole and deported to Poland in 2024. Now let me move on to the 9th point. They did not prepare a historical comparison of the race question and its history in the United States and the image that pervade the world about race relations in the US. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement. Did that mean that there was a genocide of black people in the United States? Chants of the EFF and Malema are subject to adjudication by Chapter 9 institutions. We know that the new land law was about distribution of land, equitable distribution of land, but not deprivation of land that is owned by white farmers. Now, going back to Trump, he further supported his flimsy anecdotal evidence, which mentioned that Malema filled a stadium with thousands of people, if not hundreds. But then, of what significance is that in a population of 55 million people? He also said that white farmers were fleeing to the United States, Australia, and other countries in large numbers. Now, statistics once again have been brought to bear. I think in the stats of 2025, early 2025 or late 2024, which indicated that there were 359,000 white South Africans who have returned in the past 5 years. Now, there is substantial evidence from different sources which indicate that South African white farmers go to Mozambique, Angola, Congo, Brazzaville, Zambia, and other places where they are making a lot of money to support their families. Now, these statistics could have assailed Donald Trump's individuating and anecdotal evidence, and it would have raised the dialogue to a strategic level. For instance, he has a tendency of referring to people at a personal level, like he did when he mentioned just out of the blue that the Prime Minister of India was his personal friend, and he mentioned Putin's rejection or ejection from G20. Now, here was an opportunity to mention that the two are part of BRICS and work with South Africa closely, including the other two partners, Brazil and China. You don't have to give details there. You don't have to talk about individuals being mutual friends. The mention of Brazil would have stabilized Trump, especially China, which he regards as anathema to the US. We know his attitude towards Brazil and, of course, Mexico next door, not even to mention Canada. But the 10th point is reference to post-apartheid mechanisms to avoid reprisals for iniquities of apartheid, the TRC. It was set in place. There were sunset clauses. Now, this is in sharp contrast to the Israeli vengeance on the Nazis or on anyone here. There's no vengeance against anyone here. Now, that could have been a point worth mentioning. Now, why are South African experts that have been mentioned coming back home if there is a genocide? Does that make sense? It doesn't. But of course, there are many things that didn't make sense. But you see, all I'm saying is not that everything that is said should have been rebutted, but just a kind diplomatic reminder that South Africa was faring better in certain respects, and even forget about these few people who have migrated to the United States. How many? 49 or 59, whatever figure. It's so insignificant that it's not worth mentioning. The point is, Palestinians in Gaza are dying in hundreds and thousands. And that was the elephant in the room. The same as the case that was taken to the ICJ by South Africa. But well, our politeness. Anyway, having mentioned these 10 points, so what? The question which now begs for an answer is, how should they have prepared better? This is what I think. First, by strategically studying Trump's encounters with Zelensky of the Ukraine and Starmer and Carney. Zelensky was ambushed, we all saw it, but he stood his ground. Starmer was groveling and embarrassing to the superlative point of degree. Carney took control of the situation and was strategically and tactically superior without being confrontational. Now, perhaps a hybrid of Zelensky's and Carney's strategies would have given the South African team an upper hand. Second, they should have drawn up a simple SWOT analysis by profiling Trump's weaknesses very closely, his hubris, weakness, and hamartia, missing the point in the Aristotelian sense. They should have profiled his strength, their strength, his weaknesses, their weaknesses, opportunities that he might have presented, and whatever threats they were. And I think the main threat here was his temper, his temperament, and that they could have easily controlled if they've prepared well with empirical facts. Third, they should not have conceded to his dictate of who they should include in their team. That is a very serious one. He took control before they even left South Africa. They should have left it to him to invite them. Fourth, they should have put in place a preemptive strategy by anticipating that he was going to use false information to accuse South Africa and obfuscate facts with the aggressions. Well, where he digressed, should have just relaxed and allow him to lapse into stereotypical rants and irrelevance of conflating unrelated issues. Fifth and finally, they should have prepared an antithesis of his argument in a diplomatic diction to counteract his accusation. Sixth, they should have urged him to stick to the agenda, especially the AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is about to expire, and its benefit for both the US and South Africa. And of course, what it boded for future bilateral relations. I'm not proposing that all these strategic suggestions should have been executed in front of the press. All what I'm simply saying is that the presenter or president would have been better prepared to avoid the subtle and overt ambush of the Idi Amin Mobutu Sese Seko of the United States. But let me say that it is too early to tell whether the objectives outlined by President Ramaphosa have been achieved or not. In certain postures, the conclusion of the encounter was hailed with acclamation and approbation. It will do no one any harm to listen to contending voices. As Mao Zedong said, let the flowers bloom and the different schools of thought contend. Well, there we are. On face value, it seems that the South African strategic planning team was lackadaisical in undertaking meticulous profiling of the whole situation, including Trump's character and temperament. I mean, the man has been analyzed thoroughly, especially by the comedians in the United States, with such intelligence, perspicacity of analysis. And these are available. I mean, we've got sharp observers like Jimmy Kimmel, Dave Chappelle, Trevor Noah, Ron Stewart, just to name a few. That is, if one was reluctant to go further, probing further into the character and the context. Now, what was distasteful was the bowl-in-hand part of our presentation. Embarrassing, begging. Having said all this, let me conclude on what may be a positive note. When you compare the two presidents, I think Ramaphosa scored higher in terms of presentation, poise, posture. One, he handled the encounter with equanimity, and his body language exuded confidence and relaxation. Two, when Trump ambushed him with the footage of people who are supposed to be paying respect to their fallen relatives, Ramaphosa acted with calmness, even though that took him by surprise. But he didn't hurry to give an answer that was out of place. Now let me end my monologue. If anything that I've said here will cause accusations, I'm going to deny that I have not said anything like politicians. Now let me shut up.